Hi, welcome to Digging for Truth. I'm your co-host, Henry Smith. And in part one of this two-part episode, we've been talking with Dr. Todd Wood about ape men, Neanderthals, and a special number of fossils. Homo naledi is one of the fossils we've been talking about. And now we're going to continue our conversation about these human fossils from the past and how fascinating they are as it relates to the Bible and the kind of evidence that's been uncovered. Now, Todd, welcome back to the show. Thank you for joining us again. We're glad to have you. We were talking about a couple of different remains that have been found, and we're encouraging folks to watch part one of this two-part episode. But we want to jump right into now a fossil that was found in the country of Georgia, or fossils, I should say, from the former Soviet Union, Dmanisi. And I'm going to let you pick that up right from there and go with it.
Yeah, Dmanisi is a fascinating story. It's a little town in the southern part of the Republic of Georgia. It's located between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea, if you're wondering where that is. Little ways west of the town, there was an archaeological site that was pretty well known for medieval artifacts. It was on the site of an ancient Christian cathedral there, ancient Christian church. And digging there ended up yielding these really old stone tools, which then alerted researchers to maybe they should be digging even further. And what came out of those digs are some of the most remarkable and bizarre skulls in the entire human fossil record. So there are 5 of them now that have been recovered. 2 of them look like sort of a typical Neanderthal. 2 of them look like something called Homo erectus, which is sort of a Southeast Asian species and similar to fossils that are also found in Africa. And then the 5th one, skull 5, is pretty different from anything we've seen in the fossil record. So skull 5 has this massive jaw and mouth region. It's got this huge brow ridge around the head. The cranial capacity, the brain size, is about a little more than half of our brain size. Looking at the bottom of the skull, this is one of the best preserved basic crania in the fossil record. The bottom of the skull, that's what that means.
Right.
And you can see the foramen magnum there is coming right out of the bottom, so this indicates this guy would walk around upright. So, as I said, 2 of those skulls look like Neanderthals. 2 of them look like Homo erectus, and then we have this, which is really different. Now, if these skulls had been found at different locations in the fossil record, right, different geographical places, different layers,
right,
the scientists, I think, would have no trouble saying, well, those are Neanderthals and those are erectus, and this is something new. But here they are all in one location, and one very small location, too. And so there's still ongoing questions about exactly what these are and what they mean. Some would argue that you have multiple species at the site, which ecologically is surprising that you would have 2 different species living side by side that are that similar. And others would say, no, this simply tells us that the variation of humans in the fossil record is much bigger than what we had considered even among sort of conventional evolutionary paleoanthropologists. So the jury's still out on this one, but it's fascinating.
Yeah, he's a mystery. Now, I heard you say in a couple of films I watched with you that you put him next to your bed at night and stare into his face, wondering about his past. Is that right? Maybe not that. Maybe not next to your bed, but in your office, I should say, right? Is that correct?
Yes, he is absolutely in my office. I see him every time I walk in and out of my office. And yes, I do. If I wake up in the middle of the night, I will often think about what in the world Dmanisi means for the entire history of humanity. It's a fascinating place.
Yeah, and this is part of the research that we need to do as Christians, that sometimes we find evidence and it just kind of leaves us uncertain about how to fully interpret it. The evidence is very limited, so we can't extrapolate too much from it, but it is fascinating and it's part of the research that you're doing. So along those lines, let's talk a little bit about the way that you've collected data from some of these different finds that have been found, Homo naledi, Neanderthals, the Dmanisi skull, and others, and how you've, for lack of a better term, put it into a computer model to sort of take a look at how it spits out. I'll let you explain what that means.
Sure. So my research, when I was growing up and going to school, when I read creationist books on human fossils, there was a lot of quoting sort of conventional scholars and evolutionary paleoanthropologists, and I was sort of wondering, well, how do we know what's human in the first place? And that led to a lot of work that involved things that aren't human, trying to develop some methodology that would help me sort of group things into the created kind. You're probably familiar with that idea. So what I've done is I've gotten these information out of papers published by evolutionary biologists looking at hominin fossils, trying to understand their evolutionary tree. And I can take that same characteristic data and run it through totally different analysis to evaluate and look for groups and clusters and try to determine what is similar to what and what is different. And in that way, potentially come up with an answer, and not just an answer, but a consistent way of examining the evidence in order to determine what is or isn't human.
Yes. Yeah, that's fascinating. We're going to put that sort of a diagram of that up on the screen to give people an idea. But if I remember correctly from your research, you collected features from all these different fossil remains. Is it 400 different identifiable features? Is that correct? Did I get that number right?
Yeah, the current matrix that I'm working with has about 391. Now, I didn't compile the matrix to begin with,
okay,
but I have been adding to it.
Okay.
I've been using published photographs of the fossils in order to add information to that matrix in order to expand our sample of information about these fossils.
Okay. Well, that's excellent. So that we want to avail people of that. We also want people to encourage people to visit your website as well, and we'll put that information up on the screen. Now, in our next segment, we are going to talk about a fossil that's been found from the past that we know is not human. It's called Lucy, and I want you to talk about that in our next segment because people have probably heard of it, but maybe there's a lot of misinformation about it. Dr. Wood is going to clear that up for us, and we'll do that in our next segment, and we'll be right back.
In a culture of intense Bible-denying skepticism, Associates for Biblical Research exists to strengthen followers of Jesus by affirming the authority of the Bible. Our archaeological fieldwork and original research form a strong foundation in upholding the reliability of the Scriptures. For students or anyone asking if they can really trust the Bible, please visit our website and partner with us by joining our prayer team or financially supporting this ministry. And thank you for standing with us.
Hi, welcome back to Digging for Truth. I'm your co-host, Henry Smith, and today we have a special guest, Dr. Todd Wood, who's joining us to talk about human fossils. And in this segment, we're going to be talking about non-human fossil, particularly one called Lucy. Now, Todd, I'd like to just let you run with that. Who is Lucy? What can you tell our audience about her, quote unquote, and give them a little bit of information about this find that they may have heard of.
Right. So the initial discovery of these fossils was made in the mid-70s in Ethiopia. For years, there had been a fossil dig much further south in Tanzania called Olduvai, and Don Johanson thought he could go farther north up into Ethiopia and look for fossils there as well. And he, in some sense, hit the jackpot. He found a lot of hominin fossils up there that people had not anticipated. What made it confusing, I think, and what I found interacting with people both on the internet and in person, is that Lucy tends to be used in a very loose way. And I don't mean that as a pun. I just thought of that. But yeah, it's kind of a Lucy name.
Yes.
Lucy is a colloquial name that he used for the actual skeleton that he found in 1974. So in 1974, he found a partial skeleton, about 40% complete, at a place called Hadar in the Afar Triangle in Ethiopia. It was named because the Beatles song "Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds" was playing at the time when they found the first bits of it.
Okay, I didn't know that, by the way.
Yeah, that's where Lucy got her name.
Okay.
So yeah, so you can guess what they were. Yeah, how they were entertaining themselves.
Yes.
Anyway, so Lucy, that became the name of that fossil. But then Johansen started using that same name for the whole group of fossils that he had found beginning in 73 and all the way forward for many additional fossil seasons of digging. And so people thought that the evidence for that particular group of fossils, which is called by the technical name Australopithecus afarensis, if you want to have a nice tongue twister,
yes.
They started thinking that was all based on that one fragmentary partial skeleton. So I've got a couple of models here from that skeleton. This piece here is what is left of her shoulder blade.
Okay.
Not much, right? This is where the arm bone right here would attach to the shoulder blade, and then you've got there's enough hair to get some information out of it, but there's not much, right? Here's the end of her femur, her thigh bone. You can see it's broken pretty substantially, but again, that's her whole thigh bone, right? I mean, there's another part of it, of course, but this is the distal part, the part down by the knee. And so people get the sense that there isn't very much evidence for Lucy at all. And in fact, there have been lots and lots of fossils, and in fact, even better fossils found in the past 20 years that in some sense very much corroborate what was discovered in the early in the 70s there with Johansen's excavations. But as you say, they're not human. My own analysis, we talked about that earlier, showed separate clusters. In one cluster, you have the things that are human, which include things like Neanderthal and Homo naledi, and then exclude things like afarensis. Afarensis is something separate, something that is not human. And
yes.
So we know that, especially with afarensis, because we've got so much fossil stuff that's available. We know a lot about afarensis, the species.
So what your research bears out, your clusters that we're going to show that on the screen to give people an idea what we're talking about. And this would be a good transition for us to talk about. There seems to be, what your argument is, a clear separation between what has human characteristics broadly. We're using that term very broadly, human, to include like Neanderthal, potentially Homo naledi, modern humans, and things like Lucy, and there's a gap. There's not a continuum. And that's where maybe we begin to talk about the biblical material. Maybe comment on that a little bit.
Yeah, that's essentially correct. That what I'm finding are these separate groups, and to be honest with you, I was surprised. I guess that shows you my lack of faith there. But I was surprised that it was as clean as it was. I thought when I went into this that it would be much more difficult because, of course, evolutionists tell you, oh, there's so much fossil evidence for human evolution, and there's just this nice transition between what is human and what is not human. And so I guess I just had in my mind that I was afraid that I might confirm that. And in fact, over the period of 10 years that I've been working on this stuff over and over again, the more I add characteristics to this matrix, the more I add fossils and new fossil discoveries to the matrix. I keep finding again and again and again, there's these hard clusters. There's one cluster that includes the humans, and there's another cluster that includes apes like Lucy and her species, afarensis.
Okay, very good. So, and reading the biblical material, taking the accounts at face value, I guess we would say we would expect those kind of results, but we ought not be afraid of going into it and examining it and seeing where the evidence leads us. It's good Christian scholarship to do so. So let's set up now that we're sort of bridging to the biblical material, let's just set up the next stage of our discussion here. These human beings, you and I have talked a little bit about in our own dialogue before the show about the flood, the extent of the flood being global, and that we see probably these people are post-flood. Let's introduce that for about a minute, and then we'll continue that in the next segment. We'll also talk about the Tower of Babel in the next segment, because that's important as well.
Sure, yeah. So my own research, and I've been thinking about this a lot and trying to understand this, but my own research would suggest that yes, most of these fossils, or all of these fossils really, are post-flood fossils, which is kind of surprising. And I say that because the kind of things that they're found in tend to be, the layers of rock they're found in tend to be very localized, unlike flood layers, which tend to go across the continent. Sometimes they tend to be found in caves that were carved into rocks formed by the flood, which would, of course, require that the flood form the rock first before the cave forms and the people get in it. And then the radiometric dates, the conventional dates can be sort of correlated to a creationist timeline based on like the RATE project from ICR, and that would all suggest that in fact, these guys are all post-flood. Yeah,
that's good. And we'll give some information about what you mean about the RATE project, radiometric dating, and all that kind of stuff for our audience, so they can get some further resources for that. But in our next segment, Dr. Wood and I are going to pick up for our final segment, about the flood, and we're going to talk about the Tower of Babel and its relationship to these fossils that have been discovered around the world. And we'll be right back after this message. Don't go away.
Bible and Spade is a non-technical quarterly publication published by the Associates for Biblical Research. Written from a scholarly and conservative viewpoint, Bible and Spade supports the inerrancy of the biblical record and is a must-read for both the serious Bible student and anyone asking if they can really trust the Bible. Archaeological evidence, properly interpreted, upholding the history of the Bible. Subscribe today at BibleArchaeology.org.
Hi, welcome back to Digging for Truth. I'm your co-host, Henry Smith, and today I have a special guest with us, Dr. Todd Wood. We're talking about human fossils from the past, the distinction between human and non-human fossils. And in this final segment, we're going to be talking about connecting some of this evidence to a biblical framework, a framework of history connected to the Bible. Now, Todd, we were talking a little bit about the flood. Our belief here at ABR, and as well as yours, is that this was a global cataclysm that wiped out the civilizations of the past before the flood, and that these people that lived in the world that are found in the record are post-flood. Well, let's talk about a major incident that occurs in the Bible that people might not think is connected to fossils, but actually very well may explain what we find, and that's the Tower of Babel incident. Why don't you go ahead with that, please?
Sure, yeah. So as I've been thinking about these things, and I don't just do stuff to figure out what is human and what isn't human, because once I've sort of sorted that out, that's sort of the first step, because then you're interested in, well, how did humanity resettle the earth after the flood? And how and why do they have the sorts of characteristics that they do? Why is it that Neanderthals, for example, only seem to have stone tools and they have fire and they bury their dead, but otherwise technologically they're quite different from what we find in what we think of as Homo sapiens, modern people. And sort of thinking through this, I've come to the sort of tentative idea that what we're really thinking about here is the Tower of Babel, and that incident really may set us up for what we find in the fossil record. So when I think about the Tower of Babel and the culture that produced it, the city that produced it, I think about living in the city that I live in, which is a pretty tiny town, but we all have our own jobs. There are people who work at the dump. There are people who work at City Hall. There are people who are policemen. There are people who are farmers. Nobody does it all, right? Nobody is a subsistence farmer who has to make basically make their own living by themselves.
Yes.
And so, thinking about Babel and how they would have built that tower or tried to build that tower, once that language confusion came, you can imagine maybe one group had no real practical skills at hunting or farming at all. And so they might end up living what we would think of as primitive life. And so perhaps what we're seeing in the fossil record is not merely the emergence of culture from animal ancestors, which is what evolutionary biologists would want you to think, but instead is a rediscovery of culture by people who've basically lost everything once that confusion at Babel happened.
Yeah, I've always thought and agree with you, and I'm glad that your expertise in terms of the fossils, now you're bringing the biblical account into it and sort of looking at that as a major impact in human society. I mean, what you're saying makes total sense. You think about, I always think about the movie with Tom Hanks, Castaway. He's not a brute, he's not a barbarian, he's an intelligent human, but he's isolated from culture, and he has to go back to catching fish with spears and doing those kind of things. And maybe that's a simplistic kind of idea, but I kind of look at that and go, think about that and the fracturing of human culture. Manifold all over the ancient Near Eastern world.
Right. Yeah. And so what you end up with are people who they remember the technology of Babel, but they don't know how to do it.
Yeah.
And so they're left with making do with whatever they can make out of the materials at hand, stones, maybe hides and that sort of thing. And so, they appear to us, and I think that Castaway analogy is pretty good. They appear to us like, these primitive people who don't know anything, but in fact, they probably do know lots of things. They just have lost key bits of information that would allow them to live a more sort of a technologically advanced existence.
Yeah, you made me think too of another maybe model in history, and that is the collapse of the Roman Empire might be an analogy too. The so-called Dark Ages come along because the Romans sort of as a civilization, you could pass on technology and knowledge, and now that structure has been destroyed. So, people living in certain places, they only know so much and they can't do the things that the Romans did. There are no more roads to connect cities and those sorts of things. So I think there are some analogies there for us. I like also what you said, and comment on this some more, the assumption we make when we see that people lived in caves. The immediate assumption is an evolutionary assumption, isn't it?
Well, I mean, we've been told to think that way, right? We've been constantly told that cavemen are primitive and but man, these guys are using, they've figured out how to use pigments, and they figured out how to make jewelry out of materials in their environment, bones and stones and seashells, and they've figured out how to paint them. This is not the activity of a guy who doesn't know what's going on. These people were very advanced, and if I was dropped into a Neanderthal tribe, I don't think I would survive very well.
Well, and you wouldn't be able to give them a DNA sample to show them that you were part of the family. I mean, that would be,
I don't know what they would think of that.
Who knows what they would think. But I think, what the point I think we're getting at for our audience and we want to emphasize here is we have a framework that Scripture gives us. It doesn't give us a lot of the details. This interesting period before Abraham, it tells us very important things, but it doesn't tell us a lot of details. So when we study these fossils, we have to be careful. We have the certainty of the biblical record. And I'd like to give you the last minute, Todd, to just share your thoughts on that as a scientist trying to relate this information to the Bible, and that this sort of a word of encouragement also to our audience about these things.
Yeah. The longer I've worked at this, the more excited I've become about God's creation. I love doing what I do. I love getting up in the morning and checking the news to see what new discoveries have been announced this morning. It's a thrill and an honor, and over again, I'm so impressed by what the Bible tells us about our history and how it relates to the the kinds of discoveries that we're making and the research that I'm doing. And I think any Christian who is confident in the Word of God and confident in God's creation should be equally excited to study the works that God has made in addition to the Word. It's a thrilling opportunity that we have to look at what God has made, and I think we should take every advantage that we can to do it.
Yeah. I think that's a great word. Encourage people to study the Word and the world, and we should pursue that, both of those, with vigor and excellence. Dr. Wood, thank you for joining us. Thank you for being on the program and sharing your expertise today.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.
Folks, thank you for watching this program.